Thanks for listening to the Get Over Yourself podcast, brought to you by Carol Fit Stationary Bike Program, 8-minute workouts to get super fit. Perfect Keto, the cleanest, highest potency ketone supplements. Mofo, male optimization formula with organs to boost testosterone. Let's get checked. At home testing kits. Try lgc.com. Almost Heaven, beautiful compact home use sauna kits. B.rad's macadamia masterpiece, the mind-blowing nut butter blend. And check out bradkearns.com/shop, my personal selection of favorite products for health, fitness, and peak performance. And here we go with the show.
Glucose is not only affected by if we're eating carbs or not. It's not just telling us if you're diabetic or not. It's influenced by your activity level. It's influenced by stress and sleep. We just don't know necessarily what foods are more optimal for you if you're not measuring it. It's hard to tell unless you have some sort of data to show you. I think what's so valuable about having the data from anything that's giving you instant feedback, CGM, but also things like Oura Ring or other biometric monitors, is that instant feedback. So our brains are hardwired to want instant gratification, right?
Hey, listeners, it is time for a fascinating show with Cara Collier. She is the Director of Nutrition for NutriSense, which is a health education company specializing in the extremely cool, ultimate cutting-edge health and medical technology of continuous glucose monitoring. Yes, for the first time in the history of humanity, you can get a little patch sensor put onto your arm, and it will give a continuous readout of your blood glucose levels for a period of 2 weeks. All the data goes right onto your smartphone. You actually put your smartphone up against your arm and perform a scan a few times a day, or more times if you want. But it will record the data every 15 minutes and put it into the beautiful app that they've designed at NutriSense, where you have all this feedback and data, and you're looking for your spikes that occur in response to meals, how well you control your blood glucose overall on a 24/7 basis, but also your response to meals, the particular content of your meals, how certain carbohydrates affect you, of course, also how things like workouts, your life stress levels, and all that great stuff play into this hugely important marker that previously we've only been able to get a very basic and perfunctory information from doing the fasting blood glucose reading when you're doing your annual exam at the doctor's office, or perhaps you're buying a blood meter like the Precision Extra, like the keto enthusiasts will test their blood ketones and their blood glucose. And I've been doing this for several years, but let's say I do it a few times a week, or maybe every day when I'm deeply immersed in a ketogenic experiment, but it's not part of my daily life, and it's a hassle and it's inconvenient, and I don't have that continuous readout and that constant feedback. I think the greatest potential for this type of technology is in the area of behavior modification. So now you have quantifiably the immediate result of doing healthy lifestyle habits, like not finishing the entire bowl of ice cream, or getting up after dinner and walking around the block. And when you hear the recommendations in theory, the research that we cite in our recent book, Keto for Life, that if you just take a simple walk after dinner at a very slow speed for not very long, like a 15-minute walk or 30-minute walk at 1 mile per hour, I believe the research was. So it's just a really casual stroll. You can mute the insulin response to your meal by 50%. That's pretty awesome. But if you can look on your smartphone in real time of this actually happening and, clearing that blood glucose more quickly, oh boy, what a fantastic path we're on. So let's listen to a great show from Cara Collier of NutriSense.io, NutriSense.io. Go check it out and get started yourself with your CGM. Director of Nutrition for NutriSense. I'm so excited to talk to you. This has been an incredible journey into the cutting edge of health. When I first found you guys and got my CGM going, all kinds of insights to discuss for the listener in hopes that they'll try out this amazing new technology. But first things first, you just made an incredible move in your life to an exciting new city. I don't know if people have heard of it, Austin, Texas.
Yeah, definitely. So I just moved to Austin from Washington, D.C. Quite a dramatic change in culture and geography between the two cities, but super excited to be here. Seems like everyone is also excited to be here because everyone's moving to Austin, but we'll see how busy it
Oh,
gets.
yeah. I'm wondering if you're out there jogging on Town Lake and like every fourth person has a patch on because it's the coolest epicenter of, health and healthy living in the whole world.
Yeah, it definitely seems like all the nutrition folks, the nutrition circle are migrating towards Austin and a lot of startup scenes here in that space. So it's an exciting place to be. I'm excited.
Well, how did you get involved with NutriSense? And I guess I can let you roll out and talk about what the company does and where things stand now with this amazing technology. I'm familiar with it from several years ago talking to Peter Attia. And if I'm not mistaken, he had to have a surgical procedure to implant a CGM into his abdomen before they had the useful consumer technology.
Yeah, the technology has come a long way in a short amount of time. So a little bit about my background and how I came to NutriSense first. So I'm a registered dietitian, and I originally started my career in the hospital systems, specifically in the ICU, critical care nutrition. And my experiences in the real world healthcare system really stemmed where I am now in my interest in metabolic health and preventative health, because so many people coming in and out of the hospital are there because of lifestyle related chronic conditions that are really stemming from poor metabolic health, insulin resistance. And it's a lot of suffering and resources and energy that felt unnecessary. And that was very frustrating for me. So I teamed up with two other co-founders and we started NutriSense to really drive at that problem we're seeing in the real world of, everyone's not taking care of themselves. And then we're seeing these consequences way down in the road. So we wanted to address metabolic health from an early stage. So at NutriSense, we are utilizing these continuous glucose monitors, specifically in a non-diabetic population. So traditionally, this technology is available by prescription for diabetics. So it is considered a medical device in the United States, and it's really mostly prescribed for type 1 diabetics who are insulin dependent, and it's sometimes prescribed in type 2 diabetics, not even that often in type 2 diabetics. Only about 30% of type 2 are wearing a CGM. And then if you're not a type 2 diabetic and you just want to optimize health or maybe prevent diabetes, it would be very hard for you to convince probably most doctors to write you a prescription. Obviously, there's nuances to that. Someone like Peter Attia or someone like that is clearly writing them for their patients, but generally they're hard to get. So we wanted to reduce that barrier to entry, allow these devices for everyone, because we really believe the power in the data and the power in monitoring glucose. And so we give you the device, our app, and then dietitian support. So we include support in the package because I'm really a firm believer that data without any sort of signal or direction is just noise, right? So we're really trying to create some signal there. It's not, the dietitian isn't there to, make you follow a specific plan. It's not Weight Watchers or something. We're just there to be sounding board for evidence and to help you point out things in your data and, maybe hold you accountable if you need that. But it's more so to be able to direct what's happening in the data, because our bodies can be confusing and sometimes there's a lot going on with glucose data. So they're there as a real person support who are trained in interpreting glucose and other data points. So that's sort of what we're doing in a nutshell. Like you said, the technology of continuous glucose monitors has come a really long time in a short amount of time. So it used to be they were really, really expensive and very invasive, and now they're becoming easier to apply. They last longer. They used to only last for 2 days, and now they last for about 2 weeks. So we can only imagine that that's going to continue to grow and be cheaper and less, maybe more discreet, less medical looking. There's a bunch of companies now trying to create these devices. So I think we're only just at the cusp of what the potential is there.
Oh, speaking of potential for the average person just to optimize health, not even in pre-diabetic risk category, but certainly anyone who has any concern whatsoever should be on this thing tomorrow. As soon as you listen to the show, I'm hoping you're gonna pop for this service. And I do have to put a plug in for the support aspect because I was blown away. I mean, when you sign up for this 2 week journey, the hand holding is absolutely spectacular, and you get such a tremendous education. I gotta think some of it must have been cut and paste because these answers came in 2 minutes, and they were so lengthy and detailed, and just with this incredible big picture overview of what was going on when I'd ask an innocent question. And I was definitely the high maintenance client of the 2020 award for all the peppering back and forth, but the support that the customer gets, and I think the educational value is tremendous. And then maybe you're not going to have one on your arm for the rest of your life nonstop, although some people probably highly recommend it. But even when your 2 weeks is over, the insights that you take forward are so helpful for, like you said, behavior modification. I think is the big potential here.
Yeah, absolutely agree. So I'm clearly in the camp that I think everybody should wear at least one of these. So the device lasts
It's a
14
bucket
days a
list
week.
item. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, because you can learn so much. Like, of course, it is useful if you have insulin resistance or prediabetes or any sort of health condition to be able to figure out what you need to tweak and do to improve and reverse that disease. But if you're a perfectly healthy person, no signs of insulin resistance, there is still so much you can learn from seeing data from your own body. Glucose is not only affected by if we're eating carbs or not. It's not just telling us if you're diabetic or not. It's influenced by your activity level. It's influenced by stress and sleep, all these different factors. And then something that's very important to keep in mind is that we all have really unique responses to food. The variability between people for the same healthy whole food is not the same from person to person. So I think this is a big insight for a non-diabetic, a healthy, non-insulin resistant person, is just learning which foods you respond better to. So for example, between me and I think you worked with Carly, who's another dietitian on my team, we're very similar in like our height, weight, activity level, but we respond to different foods very differently. So I
Is she
have a
moving to
very,
Austin also?
we're working on it. No, she's in Seattle, which is also a great
Oh
place to
yeah,
be.
hip pot.
Yeah. So I respond, I barely have any sort of glucose response to bananas, but for her, bananas lead to a big glucose response. And same with, I have massive spikes to sweet potatoes whenever I eat them, but she barely moves at all. We all just have unique responses. So I see this across the board is not everyone's going to respond to the same food in the same exact way. The end of the day, we're this unique compilation of genetics and epigenetics, and microbiome determines glucose response a lot too. And we just don't know necessarily what foods are more optimal for you if you're not measuring it. It's hard to tell unless you have some sort of data to show you.
Well, that's a really puzzling little tidbit there from you and Carly, because we've known about the glycemic index and go and look in that chart and see which carbs are more favorable and which aren't. But I guess you guys are furiously researching the possible consequences of why a banana's no big deal for you and it is for someone else, and then vice versa for the sweet potatoes. And you mentioned a few things quickly. I mean, is there some emerging research that there's the genetics, the blood type, something like that that's making it? I mean, the thing I'm concerned about is the unfavorable response when I'm thinking that a sweet potato is vastly better than a banana or what have you, but the data proves otherwise. And I also think you had some strange examples like broccoli or something in the leafy green family that everyone by and large thinks is a minimal glycemic problem, but not so for certain individuals.
Yeah, it does vary quite a bit. And so pinpointing exactly why it's probably not one reason. There's a lot of research to show that microbiome composition is a primary determinant of those various glycemic responses. So it doesn't necessarily mean one microbiome is better than the other. It's just we have a diverse species of bacteria living in our gut, and they help to break down these carbohydrates and they help to reduce that glycemic impact. But you might have a certain predominant species that breaks down a certain type of carbohydrate better than somebody else. There is a research study. So Predict2 is a different company that mapped out everyone's microbiome and then compared their glucose responses to with the CGM. And they were able, it was a good study. They had a really large number. I can't remember the exact details at this moment, but they were able to then predict how you were going to respond to a food based off of your microbiome mapping with enough of this automated analysis, which is really fascinating. So for some people, they were going to show, they knew that you won't spike from ice cream, but you'll spike from chocolate or something like that. So they were able to predict, and they were measuring, a bunch of other factors, and microbiome composition was the largest predictor of how you might respond. So it is really interesting. Trying to figure out exactly what's going on there is probably much more complicated than just one simple answer, but it's definitely true that we don't all respond well to the same exact thing. And so now I know, I've tried enough foods because I've worn enough CGMs that I know exactly which carbs I'm going to respond well to on a consistent basis, and exactly which ones are just not worth it. I don't even like them that much. I don't need to, eat the one that's spiking me way more than the other one. Even just comparing, and with glycemic index, it doesn't always, so glycemic index was done on large population scale. It was when people eat this, how does their glucose respond on average? So that's telling us how most people respond. It's maybe a good general rule of thumb. Most of the time, people respond better to berries than they do to pineapple. It's a higher glycemic index fruit, pineapple. So it's a good general rule of thumb, but there's all these variances between that. So if we're saying the average person responds to this, that means, 50% is maybe lower and 50% is maybe higher. So we're seeing that, when you're actually measuring your own, who knows where you lie on that spectrum. So it's a good general rule of thumb, but it's certainly not an end all be all to decide which carbs are best based off of glycemic index scale.
I guess we should. I'm so excited as we converse about all these things, but I think maybe we should back up for the listener who's not familiar and discuss those wonderful big picture presentation that you did when I first started my journey. Welcome, and then here are the goals and the main things we're looking for. And we're mostly familiar with our fasting blood glucose that we get at the doctor once a year, that one snapshot in time, which obviously if the number is high, it's an indicator that you have some metabolic issues, but it also could have been a bad morning where you got into a traffic jam and had a temporary spike. Or, I've known for years using the blood meters that exercise prompts these huge spikes in glucose, which by and large is desirable or necessary to complete the workout. But I like when you talked about variability as being possibly the highest objective. So maybe you can cover kind of the different things you're looking for besides just the raw number at any given point in time.
Definitely, yeah. So as you mentioned, if we're going into our doctor's office to assess glucose, you're pretty much just going to get the fasting glucose level, which is just that snapshot in time. And even just a nuance in there, traditional metrics are saying that a value below 100 is optimal, but I'm really looking for something between 70 and 90 as that sweet spot. So there is some evidence that once you start to get to the 90 to 100 range consistently, that you have an increased risk for insulin resistance, different disease states. So that's just a separate nuance of I have a different threshold of what I consider optimal versus traditional standards.
I mean, we better stop there because that's a huge deal, and that's true for many other blood values. My main man, Dr. Ron Sinha, was talking about how triglycerides under 150 is by and large the threshold and the cutoff point. He says, I want to see people under 100 because the average and the norms that we're looking at are basically the fattest, sickest population in the history of humanity. So we don't want to be in the normal range. We want to be exceptional. And so that I heard that they're kind of inching that threshold up over 100 because there's so many people, tens of millions of people in the pre-diabetic category that now they're saying under 110 or under 120 is okay. Is that a rumor, or where are we
Yeah.
standing in the
I don't know. I'm not in close
Cara's
contact
world
with,
and
yeah.
the medical establishment?
Yeah, I don't know exactly where they're moving. Nobody is necessarily telling me how they're changing the guidelines, but it used to be that the threshold was 110, maybe like 10, 15 years ago, and they'd moved it down to 100. So I was hoping that that meant that eventually they'll see the evidence and move it down to 90. I hope they don't then go back and move it back up to 110. We'll see. But you make a very good point where it's not just fasting glucose, where we're seeing the difference between a reference range and optimal values. If you look at the history of the liver function enzymes, so like your ALT, AFT, these have slowly, the reference range has grown year over year as we've become an unhealthy society. We have alarming rates of fatty liver. And now what's normal on a reference range is not even close to what was normal 10 years ago. So we really do have to dig into this deeper, because if you just get labs back and you're not getting any sort of interpretation, they might look all in the green and check marks, but that doesn't necessarily mean everything is in optimal range. And agreed with the triglycerides, I like to see it below 90, and I like to see HDL above 50. And that's what I look at the most on a lipid panel. So that's a whole different topic, but when we're looking at optimal glucose values, so there's fasting glucose, and then you might get a hemoglobin A1C from your doctor. Again, that's not a lab test I love, because it's just telling you your average glucose. It doesn't tell me anything about how high you're getting, how low you're getting, how much you're swinging around. If we think about it inherently, it's just measuring average. So that's semi-valuable, but it's not the whole picture at all. And the other thing to keep in mind about hemoglobin A1C is that it's measuring your average glucose on your red blood cells. So we're assuming with that test that your red blood cell lives for 90 days, but a lot of people don't. They're shorter or longer, which is going to skew the results of that test. So it's very common for it to come back as not a very accurate representation of your average glucose values. So I don't love like harping on A1C either as an optimal test. So then it's okay, what are we looking for in your CGM data? And of course, we still want to see what is your fasting glucose in a fasting state. But what we really want to focus on is glycemic variability and your postprandial glucose responses. So postprandial just means after eating, and that's where a lot of insights can be derived. So we're not in a fasted state all day. We want to see how is our body responding to the food we're putting into it. So we're looking at two different things in a fed state. The first one is how high is your glucose getting? We want to see glucose below 140 most of the time. So this is about
postprandial you're talking
postprandial.
about. So
yeah.
No matter what, even if I have 2 hot fudge sundaes, that means it's a bad idea if it's spiking beyond that. So like 140 is kind of your cap. And I guess you're expected to hit that after a robust meal, especially if you're including carbs.
Yeah, and so we expect our glucose to go up some if we're including carbohydrates. A lot of people want to see a completely flat line on their glucose, and I don't think there's necessarily an added benefit to never having glucose move. We just want to keep it within homeostatic ranges, and we don't want to see it moving all day long. We don't want like a big up and down all day long. So let's say you're eating a meal, you have some carbohydrates, glucose goes up. We want to keep it below that 140 threshold, because when we get above that on a frequent repeated basis, that spike, that glucose value in your blood vessels is damaging to the actual endothelial tissue. So this is where the connection between glucose levels and cardiovascular disease is really strong. So each time you have a large spike in glucose, that's damaging to your blood vessels. So we want to keep that below a certain threshold, but we also want to look at what the shape of your glucose response looks like. So let's say you only went up to 130, that would be pretty good, but you stayed up at 130 for 3 hours. That's a long glucose response. It's a big area under the curve. And what we know is that that's a good proxy for our insulin response. So we think about insulin and glucose. Insulin does many, many things, but one of its primary functions is to bring glucose levels back down to normal. because the body doesn't like glucose being high for too long. It wants it in this tight homeostatic range. So if glucose goes up, we release insulin, it should come back down. That shows that our cells are sensitive to the effects of insulin. We're not insulin resistant, and that where glucose is coming back down to normal within 2 to 3 hours of eating is what we're looking for. And if it's not, if it's this big prolonged response, that's showing that the body is pumping out insulin during that whole time to try to get glucose back into normal ranges. So for a healthy person that is not insulin resistant, you might see one of those big prolonged glucose responses if you just have like a massive all out like standard American diet meal. Like if you have cheeseburger with French fries and a milkshake, that may not signal that you're not insulin sensitive. It's just that it was a lot of energy you're throwing at your system at once. So we have a bunch of fat in a standard American meal that slows down digestion. So then glucose takes a long time to go through the system. So you'll see that big response. You might not get that high, but it's a large area under the curve. That's not a positive response. Where vice versa, maybe you eat what would be considered a healthy, whole food based meal, an appropriate portion size. Maybe it was like a steak and a sweet potato. But let's say you're insulin resistant, you might have a large glucose response and a long glucose response because your cells aren't very sensitive to those effects of insulin. And so the body's having a hard time bringing glucose back down into normal ranges. So there could be different reasons that negative response is occurring. But in general, we want to see how high is your glucose going and is it coming back down to pre-meal glucose values within 2 to 3 hours of eating, that general shape of the curve.
So getting that glucose back down to normal implies that you're insulin sensitive. So the insulin is still coming into the bloodstream, but it's doing a job quickly and efficiently. It doesn't have to work for 3 hours. It can punch it out in 1 hour because your cells are so receptive to the signaling of insulin. And I guess that's why that's such an important tracker. Because insulin resistance, as we know, is the path to metabolic disease, metabolic syndrome, diabetes, heart disease, cancer, all these things. Back to that scary insight that when you spike up over 140 or when you're up and over 130, 140 for a long time, it's damaging the cell. How is this taking place? How is that happening?
Yeah. So if we think at, we could look at it in like a zoomed in level, and then we can also look at it at like a larger level. So the damage is mostly done to the microvasculature of the body. So if we're thinking about each glucose spike, there's this concept of glucotoxicity, where too much glucose in the blood vessels in circulation is toxic to our systems. So each large spike, so maybe you're hitting 160, but it comes back down to normal. That little spike can cause some microvasculature damage, which releases some inflammatory molecules and causes some oxidative stress. And then the body should come in and correct that. It can handle, the inflammation is occurring so that the body knows to correct it and it works it through. So if you have a glucose spike that's really high every once in a while, it's okay. Like your body's going to be able to correct this. Like it's okay. Some people that have a spike one time and they're like, is everything gonna like break? Am I insulin resistant? It's like, it's okay. Every once in a while we can have something that spikes your glucose and your body can fix it. But it's about repeated exposure. If every single day for breakfast we're having a cereal and banana and we're having a glucose spike to 180, you're creating that damage and oxidative stress every single morning, that's going to accumulate and your body's going to have a hard time always correcting that and getting back down to normal. So that's where we see repeated damage and we start to get this negative feedback loop. And that's where you can kind of look at a more zoomed out level, is these multiple offenses when we get stuck in this negative feedback loop. That's when we start to see insulin resistance really drive up. And we know insulin resistance doesn't just cause diabetes. As you mentioned, it is a primary driver for cardiovascular disease risk, for neurological problems like dementia, for kidney disease, hormone dysregulation. It's driving a lot of these metabolic problems. So when we get in this negative feedback loop, that's where we see some serious issues. And it's like that with glycemic variability. So those big swings up and down that you miss when you're just measuring average glucose or fasting glucose, you can't see that that damage is occurring. And that's an independent risk factor for these problems like cardiovascular disease risk. That makes sense.
Sure. And if we're struggling a little bit to hang with the science, I love Dr. Kate Shanahan's insight on this concept. When you're eating the cotton candy or making a pineapple smoothie, and your fingers get sticky because you're dealing with the carbohydrate source, these molecules are sticky when they're ingested, and they go and guck up the important proteins that are the building blocks of the body and the controlling the function of numerous organs and tissues in the body. And I think the damage is worse on the longest lasting cells and tissues in the body. And that's why you mentioned the eyes, you mentioned the kidneys, the heart and the cardiovascular system, and the skin, the collagen and the elastin. And so what do we get? We have diabetics who are known to have vision problems and kidney problems. We have the heart disease epidemic, #1 killer. And then we have the wrinkly skin of old people because that collagen elastin is getting worn down by the high insulin producing diet, the high carbohydrate, probably too much glycemic variability. Geez.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a huge link between glycemic variability and just longevity, health span, because of this sticky glucose that's getting stuck to your proteins. So fancy term for this is it's called AGEs, advanced glycation end products.
Imagine that. What an acronym. Yeah.
I know, how fitting, right? It literally ages you because we're adding sugar to proteins where we don't want them to be. So yeah, how I describe this is you're caramelizing your proteins, and we don't want them caramelized, right? We want them to be proteins. So when we caramelize them, it's like you're cooking it. It's literally damaging the actual DNA structure and cellular functions of the cells. And we can only imagine that that's going to speed up our natural aging system. And it also leads to chronic inflammation because the body's like, we have some damage, we need to come fix it up. So it sends a bunch of inflammatory molecules to try to clean up. But if you're doing it day in and day out, like I said, that feedback loop where you're constantly cleaning up a mess that's just growing faster than you can clean it. So
I cut you off. As AGEs is advanced glycation end products.
Exactly.
Right. And that's the sticky molecules messing up our cellular structure. So we now know that we don't want these frequent and or prolonged spikes. And then we have the extreme health enthusiast like myself or whoever's competitive and wanting to look at these numbers. Is there any rationale or any concern about, let's say, not getting these occasional glucose spikes, like eating an extremely low carbohydrate diet and working out and fasting a lot and obsessing with your numbers, so that you're tightening up this glucose variability to the extent that you get, I believe some people call it metabolic insulin resistance, where you're producing insulin so minimally that now all of a sudden your cells are no longer sensitive to the effects of insulin. So you're kind of in a what do you call it? A backwards cycle back to a square one that's maybe not optimal.
Yeah, we do see this quite often, especially if somebody is very strict, zero carbohydrate or very low carbohydrate for a prolonged period of time. So I usually start to see this adaptation around like year 1 of doing very strict zero carbs for at least a year. Everyone's a little different. And yeah, it's this idea of adaptive glucose sparing or physiological insulin resistance. It's not the same thing as the insulin resistance that comes with diabetes. That's pathological. It is different. And I think it's up for debate whether it's a bad thing or a good thing. We can dive into it a little bit more. Essentially, the body is super adaptive, right? It's going to figure out that you're never giving me any glucose from food. I'm never getting carbs. So I don't need to practice this glucose metabolizing machinery very often. It's not going to put out something it's never getting used. Body is super adaptive and it wants to conserve energy. So instead, it lowers those insulin levels because it's never having to stimulate insulin as much with carbohydrates. And then the muscles start to go into what I call glucose refusal mode. And they start to prefer fatty acids as their primary fuel source when normally our muscles are utilizing glucose as a primary fuel source most of the time. So it starts to reject the circulating glucose and prefer fat. So normally what happens in these people is that we start to see a fasting glucose rise over time. So you might have started, when you first switched to a very strict ketogenic diet, maybe your fasting glucose was 75, and then a year later it's 80, and then 3 years later we're seeing at 100, and then you're on year 4 and you're like, it's 110, what is going on? So this is what we see is this gradual increase in your fasting glucose levels, because the body is like, not getting carbs from food, I'm going to increase how much glucose I'm making so that I have enough glucose present for glucose sensitive organs such as the brain. It wants to make sure there's enough available. So it's changing its homeostatic threshold. But it's not the same as if your fasting glucose is rising because you have diabetes. So in these people, we want to double check that everything else looks good, right? That HDL and triglycerides is where we want it. Your fasting insulin is low. You have a good body composition, not a lot of fat in the belly area. And if all of those things check out, then we can be more confident that it's just a natural adaptation and not necessarily a bad thing or going to increase your risk for disease. But the caveat I will say is that it makes you less flexible to eating carbohydrates. So let's say, it's your birthday and you want to have cake and whatever, you're going to have a much higher glucose response to that than somebody who is used to burning both fat and glucose as a fuel source. Because your body hasn't seen glucose in a year and you just throw a bunch of carbs at it, it's going to overreact. Fasting insulin is low. The muscles are refusing those glucose. So I'll see people like this have a big cheat meal and their glucose will rise to 300, 400 because the body just doesn't know how to process it. And that's kind of scary. I mean, certainly not a great thing if you do that really rarely or you really like sticking to the strict ketogenic diet. It's probably fine. But if you want to occasionally be able to eat carbohydrates and your body responds well to that, we might want to cycle in some carbohydrates here and there so that you're flexible to both processing fat as fuel and glucose as fuel. So from my viewpoint, I want to be able to have some carbs sometimes. So I include carbs most of the time in my diet. I do some cyclical approaches just because I want to make sure my machinery for both fuel sources is always primed and ready to go. But that's the nuance, is you can see this adaptation happen. We don't necessarily believe that it's increasing your risk for disease, but it's making you less flexible to a more nuanced eating pattern where you can kind of eat whatever type of carbohydrate or macronutrient you want.
Very well explained. Thank you. And I think I can relate to some of that in my foray into ketogenic eating, starting in 2017 when Mark Sisson and I started working on the keto reset diet. So we had to live the dream, baby, and walk our talk. And I noticed some surprisingly elevated fasting glucose levels and feeling bombed out after a high carbohydrate meal that perhaps I hadn't had for a few months. So it definitely makes sense and seems sensible that your striving for metabolic flexibility includes giving yourself, which by and large most people are not averse to enjoying some carbohydrates in the name of health now and then. But you made that clear distinction between the people who are teetering on the edge of, so we don't want to give out hall passes to people that already have plenty of carbohydrates or a history of eating carbohydrates. But I also should put in the extra wrinkle here of the fitness angle and athletic training efforts, and especially in my case where I have a few kind of factors to mark in the checkbox. One of them is my advanced age. I'm still trying to do magnificent athletic feats at the age of 55, and I'm on a low carbohydrate diet and trying to recover from these workouts. And sometimes if you throw those all together, it could be too many stress factors, and you're possibly looking at a strategy where strategic inclusion of carbohydrates to fine tune that insulin sensitivity and become more flexible could lower the stress impact of everything, including help you recover from workouts faster. And I definitely can feel that myself, that it's probably okay to throw in the popcorn, the sweet potato fries, the corn tortillas, and not be so fixated on keeping that glucose continually low and trying not to see any spikes.
Definitely. And I think that's where CGM can be very useful, because you can play around with this. How many carbohydrates do I need to avoid a big spike, but to occasionally have them in my system? When is it best for me to include those carbohydrates? What type of carbohydrates? So there's a lot of nuance, and we respond differently. The more physically active you are, the better you're going to be able to tolerate a little bit more carbohydrates in your diet, especially if you time those carbs after your workout. You're going to see less of a glucose spike because you just increased your insulin sensitivity by moving your body and moving around and stimulating your muscles. So I think there's a lot of value to being able to see, where can I strategically place in some carbohydrates? If you're somebody who's been very low carbohydrate for a long time, I think you can gain a lot of value from kind of playing with that a little bit and seeing where you can place still healthy carbohydrates. We don't want to necessarily go into refined carbohydrates ever for anybody. We want them to be whole foods, but you can play with that schedule. And like you said, with stressors, so all these hormetic stressors work on a U-shaped curve, right? So things like calorie restriction, carb restriction, fasting, sauna, high intensity exercise, all of these things are good for your body. What doesn't kill us makes us stronger. Our body's going to come back stronger. But we are putting stress on our system with all of these changes. And too much of a good thing can become a bad thing. So we have to be careful about, not going to that U-shaped curve where we're starting to see negative effects from too many stressors piled on top of each other. And I see this sometimes with people who are doing all of these great habits, lots of cold therapy, heat therapy, exercise, really dialing in their diet. And then they'll also do extended fasts, and they'll see their glucose rise while they're fasting, when it should be lowering, or it should be static in that 70 to 90 range for the most part when you're doing an extended fast. But sometimes when we're putting too much stress on our body, and then we're trying to put it through this long extended fast, we might see some people's glucose increase. And that is a signal that we're under too much stress. Your body's in this fight or flight mode, and it's pumping out cortisol to try to raise glucose levels because it's feeling a little too many stressors. So that's something that we have noticed from just seeing so many data points at this point from different people, is that you can add on too many stressors and you can burn your body out, and glucose will rise when stress is occurring.
Well, gee, that's the beautiful thing of having this little guy on your arm, is to keep track of these stressors and how you're managing them. And I feel like the simple example of getting up after dinner and taking a walk, we've referenced research in our book Keto for Life. I forget which exact study, but it was something like a really slow and brief walk can mute the insulin response by 50% after a meal. So if you're sitting there looking at your smartphone and watching the numbers, knowing that you can get up and walk around the block, and now prove it to yourself and have that data to check in and reference your graph. And the software is incredible, people. And the amount of categorizing and scoring and reference points and the ability to write in notes so you can remember what you did gives you this remarkable database of life experience and how to optimize health. So I love that part of it, and especially the most amazing insight. I'll say my wife wore one for 2 weeks, and then I wore one for 2 weeks, and I put hers on first because she was coming off an incredible work binge of several years where she was sitting for at least 12 hours a day and, going crazy. And then right when she got the thing on her arm, was vacation time, and went hiking like crazy for 2 weeks straight. We were in Yosemite, we were in Tahoe, and every day was extremely active, the exact opposite of her previous life. And she went in 2 weeks from a pre-diabetic risk category to extremely metabolically healthy, where the meals were having almost no spike in glucose, and the variability was so tight, the return to baseline, the baseline had dropped in 2 weeks. So, I mean, at the doctor's office, when you deliver the fasting glucose number, if you go down that route, they're likely to put you on medication or who knows what. But you have so much potential in your hands. And we're talking about, now hundreds of millions of people across the globe who are at a crossroads where they're either going to have a steady, disgraceful demise into diabetic and, a pathetic existence for years and decades, or, complete metabolic health where they can build on their success and see it. That must be the most exciting thing for you guys.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for sharing that story. It's so nice to hear. And it's so true. We can see these benefits from small, simple changes in a really, really quick amount of time for a lot of people. So especially if you're on the cusp of like pre-diabetes, we can make such meaningful change in a short amount of time. And one of the easiest ways to do that is just moving your body, like you said, just going on walks after meal, going on a walk in a fasted state in the morning. It doesn't have to be that now all of a sudden you go to the gym every day for 2 hours and you're lifting heavy weights, which I'm all for weightlifting and exercise, but it can be super simple. It can be just moving your body. When the gyms closed and we were in lockdown, all I had next to my desk was a 25-pound kettlebell, and just moving every 5 minutes on the hour. I've been sitting in front of a computer for an hour, do a 5-minute little burst, and then go back down. I was wearing CGM at the time, and that makes such a meaningful difference. So some really easy changes that we can implement into our day-to-day life that can make a huge difference. And I think what's so valuable about having the data from anything that's giving you instant feedback, CGM, but also things like Oura Ring or other biometric monitors, is that instant feedback. So our brains are hardwired to want instant gratification, right? This is part of the reason that things like social media are so addicting. We love this instant gratification. And for a lot of health behaviors that we want to build to create a long, healthy, happy life, they don't give us instant gratification. So normally, if I'm not getting any immediate feedback from a device, if I'm doing these 5-minute bursts throughout the day, I might not know if it's working. It might not be that motivating because I'm like, I don't know, like I'm doing it because somebody on the internet said it was a good idea and I thought maybe I'll try it. But then I stop the habit 2 weeks later because I'm like, I don't really know if it worked or not. You're not seeing any meaningful change right away. But what's important about a device like this is that I'm seeing instantly, oh, wow, that made a huge impact on my glucose values for the rest of the day. Brought down my average, and it made my response to a meal lower later the day. So I can see instantly, okay, that works. I'll stick with that. It makes a very sticky habit when you can get reinforcement right away. Same with good behaviors and negative behaviors, right? So something like there was bagels in the office because somebody brought it in for, whatever reason. And it's like kind of mindlessly eat it. And maybe my glucose goes to 180. And I'm like, that totally wasn't worth it. I didn't even really like the bagel. It was stale, whatever. And so now I have this immediate feedback that was a negative response. It wasn't worth it. And next time somebody brings in semi-stale bagels to the office, I'm not going to do it because I know I had that immediate feedback from the device that it wasn't worth it and it had a negative consequence attached to it. Which if you're not getting any data, then I might not know. I could eat a bagel every single day and it might be 20 years before I go to the doctor's office and it's with that, out of the reference range. So there's this huge time gap in your feedback you're getting. So we're trying to bridge that time gap and make that quicker because that's where real meaningful changes and sticky habits start developing. I think that's part of the huge power in any sort of device that's giving you immediate feedback.
Yeah, I want to share the two most shocking isolated insights that we got from Mia Moore using it and me. And for her, the single most dramatic spike, which was so far off the charts that it literally went above the charts, was from an argument. So we had a
Mm.
random visitor come by and for a quick visit, a friend of a friend, right? And they got it. The lady started talking about wearing masks and COVID, and contentious how it's become political and all this. And she wouldn't stop. She was on a roll, and we were like, "Yeah, we don't like talking about it because it's sort of divisive. I'd rather talk about
Hmm.
something else." But it went into this mode where the person wearing the CGM was upset, and she like excused herself politely, but then scanning the thing was like, oh my gosh, wait, we weren't even eating at that time, and it was a higher spike than anything. So that fight or flight response is dumping glucose in the bloodstream like nothing
Hmm.
else. Same with the workout where we're seeing these spikes, and I'm like, oh, that's why, because I needed the sugar to do my final set or my another group of sprints. And then the other one I was going to mention was one day I was really tired and I had a treat of sweet potato fries and I think one bite of ice cream. So ordinarily, that wouldn't have much of an impact, but the combination of really feeling crappy late afternoon and then binging on the carbs together produced this massive spike that was out of the ordinary from, let's say, I was feeling great and I had some sweet potato fries and one bite of ice cream. So anyway, listeners, those are fun stuff. And the other thing I was going to ask was, okay, 97% of the people listening are going to go get one immediately, but let's say it takes a week. And so right now, over the next week, I think there's some, uh, uh, subjective ways that we can tell whether we're excelling with our diet or not in relation to our glucose variability and the ability to control it. And I guess one of them would be feeling like crap after a particular meal. Indicating that that glucose is circulating around and the insulin's coming in and it's taking too long to get you back to alert and feeling normal. Is that a relevant insight?
Yes, definitely. A lot of people will feel either an energy crash after meals or brain fog, difficulty concentrating, just like lethargy in the middle of the day. Those might be a signal that glucose is that glycemic variability. You might be on a glucose roller coaster. And so a lot of times it has to do with our energy levels and it has to do with just how we can concentrate and how we feel. So those are good subjective experiences to start paying attention to. You can even, if you don't have a CGM, if you can't get one, you can even jot this down, compare it to what did I eat and how did I feel? Actually pay attention to how you felt. And you could start to see correlations most likely of, okay, whenever I include this one ingredient in my meals, I crash afterwards. So then you can tweak with that and play with it and see, okay, which components of my meals are making me feel cruddy. We don't want to feel cruddy after we eat, right? It shouldn't have to be that way. And another big component is when you're eating your meals. What we see a lot of times with people, I don't know if you or your wife notice this, is that you can eat the same exact meal late at night. You're going to have a much higher and prolonged glucose response than if you ate that earlier in the day. So if you're feeling not great or you're not sleeping great, try to eat your meals a little bit earlier. Align them with sunlight hours is a good rule of thumb. If the sun's out, it might be a better time to eat than if it's dark in the middle of the night. It's not really a great time for our body to be trying to metabolizing food. We're not meant to be eating at 2 a.m.
Oh, for sure. So I'm curious. We talked about your bananas and your sweet potatoes with Carly, but how many foods have you tested yourself? And like, what does your database look like in terms of what works for you and what's like a red flag food?
Yeah, I've tried just about everything that I at least enjoy eating.
They see her
And
coming
so
at Whole Foods in Austin. I'm like, oh, there's the tester girl. She buys one of these, one of these, one of these. Yeah.
yeah, absolutely. I've tried just about every fruit that, is common at least, and every like starchy vegetable, almost all category of carbs I've tried. So ones that I'm like, I don't even really like it that much is a huge glucose spike. Like I'm good, never touching this again would be grapes, pineapple, quinoa surprisingly spikes me way higher than any other grain. Like white rice is half the response of quinoa. So I'm like, I will never, I'm good. I don't even really like it. And then there's foods that surprised me, like, yeah, bananas were very low. Butternut squash was much lower than sweet potatoes. White potatoes was much lower than sweet potatoes.
Mm.
So if I'm making a potato choice, at a restaurant, you sometimes get a choice. You often pay more for the sweet potatoes or more for the quinoa. I'm going to take the cheaper version because I know I respond better to that. And so that's a big thing. And another is the level of processing of a food. I've tried a wide variety of like instant oats versus rolled oats versus steel cut oats. And the difference in glucose response is pretty staggering. So from instant oats, I increase almost 50 points. So I could go from 70 to 120, where with steel cut oats, it's on average only about 20 points increase. So maybe I go from 70 to 90. So just that level of processing in a food, it's the same oat at the end of the day, but we've steamed it and squashed it and rolled it and pre-cooked it. And now it's just these individual glucose molecules ready to digest in the instant oats. It's not the same thing anymore as the original state of the oat. So little things like that, where it's like, if somebody, if my only option is instant oats, I'm going to skip it. I'm good. Like, I don't want that. I don't even really like it. So I can make these more mindful decisions because of how I know I respond. And if I know I miss my morning workout and I'm going to have to do it in the evening, my breakfast is going to be low carb, just eggs, maybe some greens and maybe avocado. If I did my morning workout, I might include some more fruit in that meal to have a little bit of carbs in my breakfast meal, because I know my response is going to be much higher if I haven't worked out at all in the morning and I'm breaking a fast for the day. So simple things like that I've switched around. There's a long list of insights. I think for most people, it takes 1 to 3 months to gather a lot of insights. Depends on where you're at in your health journey. But it's about testing different things, trying different foods, different combinations and timing. And then after that, once you've really dialed in what works best for you uniquely, it's all about that behavior change of wearing it, like we talked about, where it's like, okay, when I have it on, even though I know exactly how I respond to different things, it helps drive that behavior. It's more intrinsically motivating to say no to something or to do something when I have that data right there in my face and you can't hide from it. So that's really the biggest benefit once you've been wearing it for a while.
You can't hide from it because you have to scan every 8 hours or you'll miss some time gaps. But then you got to answer to your graph, baby. You're looking back going, okay, did I execute or not? Well, now NutriSense must be getting a ton of data from clients. And I'm curious, like, what trends do you see in your client demographic? Who is doing this stuff? Is it a bunch of extreme freaks from Austin with toe shoes that jog around Town Lake and do copy Brad Kern's videos with their bench jumping and weird exercises? Or are we talking about mainstream America, diabetes risk factor people who are taking matters into their own hands across the board? What does it look like now?
Yeah, it's actually about a 50-50 split at this
50-50 Austin
time.
freaks versus pre-diabetic average
Yeah,
citizen.
exactly. Yeah, so everybody is different than, maybe when I was in the ICU in the hospitals where they didn't really care at all about what they were doing. At least everybody coming to us, they're taking their health in their own hands. They want to do something about it. They're motivated. But about 50% they're really looking for optimization. They're looking to find that little tweak and to take it to the next level, where about the other half is maybe they're pre-diabetic and they don't want to become diabetic and they're ready to make some changes. So we see about a 50-50 split, which makes it very fun.
Well, I might have to come up with 2 different names.
Yeah, that's true.
Badassglucosepatch.com. And then the other one is, get checked, stay healthy. Oh my gosh. It's really, it's amazing. And you talked about the starting point with your journey, which is so fascinating because I believe that the registered dietitian educational track is highly steeped in conventional wisdom, grain-based diet and all that stuff. And now you've kind of made a dramatic departure from that. And maybe you could talk to that a little bit, because it must have been, I don't know, disillusioning like you describe, and your education has nothing to do with what you're doing now in a way.
Yep, that's exactly right. So it didn't really match up to anything that seemed to be working. So traditional dietetics teaching, it's the my plate. It's, fill most of your plate
even
with,
even today,
whatever.
you're saying like this is a registered dietitian student is going and learning about My Plate and the tremendous
Yeah.
importance of grains in the diet. And I guess
My Plate,
managing
calories
blood
in,
sugar.
calories out.
Ay, ay, ay.
Managing blood sugar doesn't get touched in any regard except for a diabetic. And even that, we're taught to teach diabetics how to carb count, how to count their carbohydrates and match it to, their insulin. We're insulin dosing based off of carb counting. So I obviously very much don't agree with that approach now, but that was what I was taught. And I think I'm enough of a self-led learner that when I'm in the setting, I'm applying these things I learned and you see they're not really working, not making any sort of meaningful impact, where it's like, okay, I no longer trust what I was taught and I need to learn it on my own. And it's all about diving into the research and doing it yourself and figuring out what works and what doesn't. And a lot of those traditional teachings, unfortunately, aren't getting the job done. And it's frustrating. And I have a team of dietitians underneath me now. I helped start this company. I was the only dietitian. And now we have other coaches who are helping our customers. And so we're really vetting for, okay, do you think outside the box? What do you recommend? And screening right away and then teaching them what we've learned about glucose. Because a lot of this was uncharted territory where there's not a lot of research on what is optimal glucose values for a non-diabetic. So we had to learn a lot of this in the beginning, but now we've seen enough where it's very clear. But it's hard to find great dietitians who are thinking outside of the traditional teaching. If anyone is listening to this and they are a great dietitian, reach out to me, because I would love to hear from any dietitians that really, question what we were taught, because it's not helping. We haven't made any great strides with our traditional recommendations. The dietary guidelines for America, I think, are extremely skewed and off from what is actually beneficial. We're recommending 45 to 65% of our calories to come from carbohydrates. I've seen very, very few people who can eat that many carbohydrates and have good glucose control. And that's what we're recommending for the average person. The average person is overweight, sedentary, and eating refined carbohydrates. Why are we recommending so many carbohydrates then? There's just a lot of mismatch of what actually works in reality versus what's recommended. So it is frustrating. I feel a little isolated from the dietitian community, but there are definitely good dietitians out there questioning these practices. So we'll get there, hopefully.
Hopefully. I mean, it's amazing to understand this discord when what we've been trying hasn't worked. I love the great quote from Dr. Doug McGuff, author of Body by Science, and he's an emergency room physician, so he's right there on the front lines of seeing what's happening. And he said, "Look, it's going to change." Right. Conventional wisdom is going to come around. Pretty soon, all dietitians are going to be listening to Cara, and she's going to be doing online education for millions of them. But it's going to take 20 years, he said. And he goes, "I don't know about you, but I can't wait that long." And that's a pretty accurate insight of where we're headed. This stuff is not going to be around forever, where we're matching insulin injections with carbs when we have this tremendous movement that's, going strong. But it's going to take a long time. So I guess the world lost a wonderful registered dietitian in the ICU, but now you're kicking butt at NutriSense. And I think it's time to give a really nice plug and talk about what does it cost to get started. And you get your 2-week run and the coaching that's involved and how to participate.
Definitely. So you would just sign up on our website, NutriSense.io, and you just fill out a quick health questionnaire, and
NutriSense.io, because you owe it to yourself to do this. Okay, Nutri sense.io.
Exactly. Yeah. And all programs come with the dietitian support. All programs come with the continuous glucose monitors and our app, which of course tracks everything like you said. And we have programs where it's just one CGM, lasts 14 days. And you just do it once, no recurring payment, no commitment. And that's great if you just kind of want to try it out. You just want to check a few things, see what's going on. That's $175 one-time payment. And then we have monthly subscriptions. So you get 2 CGMs a month, and it continues either month to month, no commitment, or we have 3-month, 6-month, 12-month commitment. It gets cheaper the longer you commit. And that's really great if you want to really play with your diet, if you want to try different things, figure out exactly what's optimal for you, or if you have some work that you need to do. So maybe you're pre-diabetic or insulin resistant, and we want to see changes over time and see that improvement. So you can do just the 14 days, or you can stick around for a little bit longer if you want to see more data accumulated. It's hard to understand your body completely in 14 days. It's a good amount to
do
kind
a bunch
of
of
dive
crazy
in a little
stuff.
bit, to do a few tests, and see
Really,
what's going
do
on.
it like Mia Moore, come off of that 3 years of working 12-hour days, so we get a few days of leftover nonsense, and then go on a hiking binge, right? We're going to try it all in 14 days. Around the world trip with different cuisine. Who knows what the possibilities lie? Or go for a longer one. Hey, that makes sense too. Oh my gosh. And I have to say, a lot of offerings say that they come with support. Like when you buy a computer from Apple and you get support and you call and you're on hold for 45 minutes. But when you're on this journey, the coaching and the hand-holding is exceptional. And I'm talking about sending a message through the live chat operation, and then 3 minutes later, the thing dings with a lengthy, thoughtful response to what was going on throughout the time that both of us did it. So you guys are doing a great service. I don't know, maybe 5 years from now, you'll be so busy that you won't be able to offer that kind of support. So people, listeners, jump on it right now while they can hold your hand all the way through.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. Jump on it now. We try to do as high touch and be there as much or as little as you want. Some people want to be a little more self-led, and that's totally fine. Some people want me to check in every single day and say, make sure that I went to the gym today. It's like, okay, I can be there if you want me for that accountability as well. Eventually, you have to be able to learn how to do it yourself. But if we're getting started in building habits, I can be that accountability partner. So people utilize the service in a wide variety of ways, and we're there to basically meet you wherever you are and however you'd like to utilize it.
Cara Collier, you killed it. That was a great show. Thank you for taking the time. I learned so much, and I hope the listeners are highly enthused to go and pull the trigger right now. It's a life-changing experience, I have to say, no matter what level of metabolic health you're at. If you're pre-diabetic, it's an absolute must. And if you're an optimizer, oh my gosh, you're the kind of person who's spending money on coaching and quality foods. You might as well, take the guesswork out of it now and take the next step. So that is our show, everybody. Thanks for listening. Thank you for listening to the show. We would love your feedback at getoveryourselfpodcast@gmail.com. And we would also love if you could leave a rating and a review on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts. I know it's a hassle. You have to go to desktop iTunes, click on the tab that says ratings and reviews, and then click to rate the show anywhere from 5 to 5 stars. And it really helps spread the word so more people can find the show and get over themselves, because they need to. Thanks for doing it.